All right, so we will go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome this afternoon. Welcome. My name's Wesley, Financial Aid. You should all know me by now, hopefully. Shameless plug before we get started, be sure to complete your FAFSA so you can receive your financial aid on time. That is due March 15th. So we want to make sure that everything is all set on time for everyone this year. So before we get, we'll give it a few more moments before we get started, and then we'll jump right into it. I know one of the hosts can let me know if there's more people in the waiting room coming in, but looks like we're good to go. All right. So this evening, we have with us Megan Landris. She is a student loan consultant from Student Loan Planner, and we'll be getting a fantastic presentation about student loan repayment. So please feel free to use the chat. Please feel free to raise your hand throughout the session if you do have questions, and either myself or one of the other co-hosts will get to you for sure. So with that, I'll pass over to Megan. Thank you for your time in advance.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Megan Landris, and we are here to talk about student loan repayment planning. Student loans are not a fun topic, but we are going to talk about how to make them less intimidating by power of education around the repayment options that you will have post-graduation and how you can gear yourself up for success between now and then. So we're going to talk also about 5 common mistakes to avoid, which I think touches on a lot of important topics in regards to just good student loan planning. So we'll talk through those things today. So is this relevant to you? Anybody here who has student loans, who will have to borrow student loans, who has a loved one who has student loans, this is probably going to be relevant to you. We're going to talk all things about financial aid in regards to the loans and the loans repayment. So my backstory, I'm with Student Loan Planner. We're a consulting company that specifically helps folks navigate their repayment options based on all the different routes that you could go. We narrow down to the most optimal route when it comes to repayment time. So my story, I've advised on, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice already today, so bear with me, but I've advised on over 130 million at this time for about 800 clients. So I've seen a lot of student loans. And I will say the most indebted profession will be someone in the medical field. So this is definitely an important topic for nursing and for those in the medical field in some capacity. I'm what's called a certified student loan professional. So that just means I have the financial planning background along with the education around student loans more specifically to help folks navigate repayment when that time comes. So we're going to talk a lot about repayment options today. We do have a free calculator that you can download to help you wade through those different repayment options. If you want that free calculator, you can download it from studentloanplanner.com/calculator, and we'll probably switch screens and go to that here later on to start to stress test some specific examples when it comes to how to build a repayment plan. So, but studentloanplanner.com/calculator, that's where you can download exactly what I'll walk through today as well. So to kick it off, let's maybe talk through some basics of what types of loans you could have. Now, for graduate and professional degrees, there are 2 types of federal loans that you can borrow. One type is called unsubsidized loans, where you have a cap of up to $20,500 that you can borrow from that bucket. And there's also graduate plus loans, where you can borrow up to the cost of attendance after that unsubsidized loan limit is used up. So you may also have what's called subsidized loans from undergrad. The difference between the two is simply when they charge you interest and the loan limits, how much you can borrow. But unsubsidized loans and graduate loans will accrue interest when you start when they're borrowed. So from the moment they're borrowed through school, through repayment, they're going to be accruing interest. Subsidized loans do not accrue interest while you're in school. So if you have some from undergrad or you have some on your loan list, those while you're in school deferment do not accrue or in periods of certain forbearance. Now, we are in a very interesting time right now anyways, though, because of COVID. Actually, all interest rates on federally held loans is at 0%. And that had continuously been postponed. It started back in March of 2020 when COVID really hit us like a storm. And it has since been extended all the way to September 2021. So if you're wondering why you see 0% for your interest rate, that is why, because the CARES Act shut all the interest rates and payments off until September 30th, 2021 for student loan relief in regards to COVID. And we do anticipate payments, interest kicking back in at that point. So we don't think it's going to extend much further, but you have had about 18 months of no interest accrual, which has been pretty sweet. It means that your balance does not grow, interest does not get added to your principal. Now, there's also private loans that you could borrow for the cost of attendance or for your schooling. Private loans, I would say, are generally less flexible in the sense of the repayment options. And great example of their less generosity or less flexibleness is private student loans did not have the same 0% interest and payment pause that federal loans did during COVID. So good example of how just federal loans tend to be more generous, more flexible in a sense. And private loans, there are generally no forgiveness opportunities available to them. Now, depending on certain grant programs, some private loans, as long as they were borrowed for the cost of attendance and for a qualified education expense, depending on the grant program, they could be available to receive or be paid off by a grant. But private student loans do not have income-driven options for repayment, or they don't have access to a program called public service loan forgiveness, which we'll talk about today as well. So that's the differences between the two types. We have federal loans and then we have private loans. Both have different repayment options and different facts about them that make federal loans generally more flexible. So I tend to say, federal loans are great options to go for if you need aid, and you can borrow up to the cost of attendance. So that should satisfy what you need for schooling. Now, let's talk about how to maybe think about our loans once and this might be hard to think about now if you're not quite at graduation yet. You might not want to think about repayment yet, but maybe a good way to think about it to help maybe ease your mind about how you're going to be treating them post-graduation is a rule of thumb we use, which is where we try to identify, is your income going to be, or where is your income going to fall in regards to your balance? Now, if your balance is going to be much lower or about the same as your annual income post-graduation, you might want to treat this more so like a debt. And that might sound like a silly statement, but what I mean by that is federal student loans, they have forgiveness opportunity with public service loan forgiveness and longer term forgiveness, which we'll dive into here in a second. But if our balance is generally less than our annual income, mathematically, we may not be able to participate in those forgiveness options. It depends with public service loan forgiveness because that program is such a short timeline to get to the forgiveness threshold. But generally, if your balance is less than your income, we should pay those loans off sooner rather than later. And that's where we can look into like fixed repayment options or refinancing possibly. Now, if someone's balance is going to be much greater than their annual income, then we might want to consider treating this debt as a tax. And what I mean by that is instead of paying that off very aggressively, we might mathematically be better looking at that, paying on an income-driven plan, paying as little as possible so we can maximize how much we can get forgiven later on one of the income-driven options. So those are some rules of thumb to keep in mind. Just where does our balance stand in regards to our income, and do we potentially have access to some forgiveness opportunity? Everybody has access to the longer term income driven plan forgiveness, but those are some of the things you'd want to think about. And we'll talk through that a little more in depth here in a moment too. Now, those income-driven repayment options I was mentioning, they are what they sound like. They're based off of a derivative of your income. There are 4 different income-driven options that you could have access to. Generally, I'm thinking if you're borrowing around now and we don't have loans prior to 2007 or to 2010, you probably will have access to each one of these repayment plans. So the first is the oldest income-driven plan. It's called Income Contingent Repayment, or ICR for short. That was the very first income-driven option that was available. It came about in 1998. So it's the oldest one on the block. That is based on 20% of your income or discretionary income, which is where they take your adjusted gross income. They subtract the poverty line for your household size, and they base the payment off of that discretionary income number. Now, income contingent repayment has a 25-year maximum repayment period. And what that means is after 25 years of payments on that plan, whatever balance is left over is then forgiven. And it may be taxable. So we'll talk about that too. Now, these other income-driven plans are very similar. Income-based repayment is a newer option. It came about in, I think, 2009, maybe a little sooner, but it's based on 15% of that discretionary income number, same 25-year maximum repayment period. Pay as you earn came about by executive order, and it's 10% of discretionary income with a shorter time frame, 20 years to forgiveness versus 25. So usually this is a pretty nice plan if someone has access to it. And you would not have access to it if you had borrowed before October 1st, 2007, which a lot of you probably have not. And then Repay came about shortly after Pay as you earn, or REPAYE. And this is based on 10% of income as well, discretionary income. But if you're a graduate student, you have 25 years to hit your maximum repayment period. So those are some of the differences between the income-driven options. And one other big difference, so each of these income-driven plans, again, they base the payment off of income. So marriage does come into play with these repayment options. If we have a spouse that earns income that does not have student loan debt, then their income could impact what your payment is if you're filing taxes joint together. Now, there are options to exclude spousal income if you file taxes separately, which should be considered talking with the CPA. The only plan that does not allow you to exclude spousal income at all is Repay. So even if you filed separately or didn't want to include your spouse's income in the payment, Repay doesn't care. It's going to factor that in anyways. So those are some of the very key differences between these options. So let's dive into the 5 most common student loan mistakes, which will help us back into some of these student loan concepts a little clearer. So one mistake that I see folks making with their student loan debt is refinancing when you shouldn't. And what I mean by this is refinancing is a great option to reduce your interest rate. And what we've been taught traditionally about debt is we want a low interest rate on our debt. We want to pay it off as soon as possible. Now, refinancing is when we take the federal loans out of the Fed system to a private company. But when we do that, that is a very permanent decision to where we can't go back to the federal system afterwards. So refinancing when you shouldn't is a common mistake I see if someone could have been public service loan forgiveness eligible, or if they really needed the flexibility of those income-driven plans, or they could have just been a better candidate for treating the debt more like a tax, paying as little as possible on those income-driven plans to maximize how much they can get forgiven later. Refinancing does not have income-driven options, doesn't really have forgiveness opportunity, so it is a commitment to pay off those loans in that specific time frame that you chose when you refinanced. But for some folks, it does make sense. So 1B, a common mistake would be not refinancing when you should. So there are folks where that's a good repayment plan or repayment option because you probably weren't going to take advantage of any forgiveness opportunities. Maybe your income situation is very secure. You don't need the flexibility of an income-driven plan. So refinancing could be a great way to reduce your cost of that loan payback. So definitely not against refinancing, but I just want to make sure that you have a very good reason to do it if you're refinancing. You want to make sure that that's the right plan for you because there's no takebacks if that wasn't the right option. So that's 1B. Now, 2, biggest mistake I see, or most common mistake I see, is avoiding ownership because of fear of your loans. And I get it. These are big balances that we're seeing, and we've probably never seen this kind of debt, this kind of money before. And so not having an idea of how to tackle the loans can be very intimidating. Hopefully through this session, it gives you a little more knowledge around the loan situation so you feel a little more comfortable with some of these concepts and some of these planning ideas to where you don't feel like you need to avoid them or, you know, sometimes I'll see folks continuously put them into forbearance, which is an option you have to just delay making payments, which not good because interest is accruing. You're not really working towards any forgiveness timeline. So I think the sooner you have a plan, the sooner you're going to feel very confident about what that's going to look like and how that translates into your financial situation. The longer you avoid it, that's time that could have been used very productively to get you in a better situation. So avoiding ownership, never a good idea. Now, third mistake is not having perfect information about forgiveness options. And I see this a lot, especially with a program called Public Service Loan Forgiveness. So there's a couple different forgiveness opportunities that you could pursue with federal loans, maybe even private. We talked about the income-driven repayment options. Now, Public Service Loan Forgiveness, or PSLF for short, is a program I commonly see nurses eligible for because of just where your career takes you. Now, Public Service Loan Forgiveness is a program where after 120 qualifying monthly payments, maybe skip over to this one, whatever balance is left over on your loans is forgiven. And there are 5 factors that we need to check the box off for to qualify for this program, which I think intimidates some people. I also think there's a lot of really bad press about PSLF out there that is very misguided. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there and bad data. It could be a really great program. You just want to make sure you have, or you've done your due diligence on your loan situation to make sure that you qualify. And if you don't, that you find a way to qualify if that's what you want to do. But first qualification is, it sounds the most obvious, is we need to work for a qualifying employer. So for pursuing public service loan forgiveness, we have to be working in public service. And that's being employed by any government entity. So federal, state, local, tribal, city. That's any nonprofit or 501c3 entity. That's really just any tax exempt company or tax exempt entity can qualify for PSLF. And we have to be paid directly by them, so we can't be contracted with them or with a private company that works at one of these locations. We have to be paid directly by the qualifying employer. So that's one, that's first qualification. And you can confirm this too. There's what's called an employer certification form that you can submit to make sure that your employer qualifies. So it's not going to be a secret. They'll let you know right off the bat if they qualify or not. And that'll help you move on to next qualification, which is we have to work full time. So they determine full time as 30 hours on average or more, unless the employer has a different definition. So if the employer thinks 35 hours is full time, then you should work 35 hours. But if they don't have a definition, or if you're working at a couple different public service entities, as long as your hours together on average per week add up over 30, then you qualify. So Third qualification is we have to have direct loans. So only federal direct loans qualify. Private loans do not qualify for this program. If you're borrowing now, there shouldn't be an issue with you having the right types of loans. If you had borrowed before 2010, you might just want to make sure you don't have what's called FFEL loans. Those can be converted into the correct loan type though. So nothing to worry about there if you do have some of those older loans. So that's qualification 3. Qualification 4 is we must be on an income-driven plan. So like we've talked about before, there's 4 that you could choose from. And if we're going towards forgiveness, we want to be on a plan that pays the least amount. We want to get as much as we can forgiven. So probably pay or repay would be a good option if you were going towards PSLF. And then last requirement is we have to make 120 qualifying monthly payments. And a qualifying monthly payment is one that's made on time, in full, and when all 4 of those previous things I mentioned exist at the same time. So payments don't have to be consecutive, not really. It'll delay your time frame if they're not, but you don't miss out or you don't lose your payments if you stop, if you go private sector for a year and then come back. The payments you make in private sector just don't count towards the public service loan forgiveness timeline, but payments will pick back up where they left off if you re-enter public service. So I think a common misconception is you have to be at the same employer or it has to be completely consecutive, and it doesn't have to be. If you're not consecutive though, it just might push back your time frame a little bit. And then another misconception is that it's a 10-year program. And it is kind of, but more technically it's 120 qualifying payments. So you would be done in 10 years if you never missed a payment and didn't miss a year in service, but it's not just the 10-year time frame, it's making sure we do the work on these 4 to 5 qualifications here. So big important fact about public service loan forgiveness is once that loan forgiveness is achieved, we have no tax implication for the forgiven debt. And what that means is we're not taxed on that discharged amount, which is uncommon. Usually if we have a debt that's forgiven, we have to pay income taxes on it, but public service loan forgiveness is tax-free. So there's nothing you have to worry about there. So that's public service loan forgiveness. TE-PSLF may not be so relevant to anyone here, but it's like a second chance at PSLF if we were on the wrong repayment plan. So that could be something available to folks who started out, not on the right repayment option, but then switched to it later to make sure that they have the same timeline. So that's an option. The income-driven repayment, we talked about those maximum repayment periods. That's the only requirement to go towards that longer-term forgiveness, to hit that maximum repayment period. And then for nursing specifically, there's Nurse Corps, there's HRSA. There's a lot of different options that you could have if you dedicated your work to a specific facility or a specific area of need. And that is something that you could use in conjunction with PSLF or with one of these repayment strategies we're talking about. There's definitely ways to maximize and take advantage of both. So if that's something that interests anybody, we could definitely talk about that a little bit more when it comes to question time. So that was misconception or common mistake number 3. Common mistake number 4 would be using one of the following repayment plans. And let me maybe set the stage with saying, really to go back and talk about our rule of thumb, there's one of 2 routes you want to take your student loans when it comes to repayment. We want to either go at them pretty aggressively, pay them off sooner rather than later, or we want to be really passive, go that forgiveness route, pay as little as possible to maximize how much we can get forgiven. So if we find ourselves somewhere in between, we do end up paying a little bit more than we might need to. So one of these repayment options could be a plan that has you pay more than you might need to. So income-based repayment. Now, this repayment option is an income-driven plan, but it's based on 15% of your discretionary income. and it has a 25-year time frame to forgiveness. So if you had access to pay as you earn and you wanted, a 10% of your income, 20-year time frame to forgiveness option, income-based repayment isn't very attractive. And this is still around because folks who did borrow before 2007 may only have access to income-based repayment if they don't want to be on Repay. So this is still relevant for some folks, but probably not for anybody in this room. Same thing with income contingent repayment. It is an income-driven plan, but you pay a lot more for not really a good benefit. So I typically don't see income contingent repayment or income-based repayment being optimal or efficient repayment routes. It's usually Repay or Pay. Now, there is a repayment plan, it's called the extended repayment plan, where they will spread your payments out over a 25-year time frame on either a fixed or a graduated repayment schedule. Graduated just means your payment increases every 2 years. But so the extended, again, not really optimal, because if we could go towards a plan that has forgiveness in 20, why would we commit to paying it all off in 25 years? So I rarely find this plan making sense, and it doesn't qualify for, forgiveness in any way, or PSLF. It's not typically an option I see. The standard repayment plan, somewhat similar to the extended, depending on your balance, which for nursing students, this time frame would probably be 30 years for you. But what it does is it spreads your payment out over 30 years. You pay off that entire balance within that 30-year period. But again, why would we want to go on that if we can get the loans forgiven in 20 years, or if our plan was to pay them off more aggressively? And then the graduated, like I mentioned, every 2 years that payment increases, not based on income. I think it was meant to mimic income growth, but mathematically it's a very inefficient plan because it front loads all the interest. So all you pay is really interest in the very beginning. And then, over time that payment continues to increase, even if your income never increases. So it's almost like a ticking time bomb, and it's just usually not optimal compared to other options. So that brings me to our fifth common mistake, is using anything but one of these two repayment strategies. And that's being either super passive with the loans, going on an income-driven plan, going towards forgiveness, or being super aggressive, which would be better for folks who had a balance lower or about the same as their annual income. This might be more optimal. So those are the two maybe routes you want to think about as far as how we want to tackle the balance post-graduation. So worst case, this is maybe a good way to think about it. Your loans are a tax on your income, meaning maybe your path is to go the forgiveness route, at which point, you're only going to pay, 10 to 15 or 20%, which again, we don't want to do IBR at 15 or ICR at 20. So really it's a 10% tax on your income for the profession you chose until you get to forgiveness. So from that perspective, it makes it a little easier to digest if we're not going to pay it off really aggressively. We think about it more like a tax per month. Or you refinance and pay the balance off because it is a debt, or because tax isn't attractive. So again, if you owe less than your income, this is an optimal route. So that's maybe the two ways to think about it. It's either a tax or a debt, just kind of bringing that full circle there. And 5 quick tips, so just to kind of round out some of these thoughts and conversations. 1, you really want to beware of paying your debt back when you shouldn't. So a common question I do get is, what should you do in school with your loans? Should you be paying the interest? Should you pay if you can? And the answer to that is always, whether or not you should do it, is it depends. And it depends on if you plan on paying the balance off or if you plan on pursuing forgiveness with the loans. If you plan on paying the balance off, not relying on forgiveness, or not, your career's not going to take you that route, then every penny you can put towards it does make a difference. So if you're able to pay a little bit during school, then that could definitely make the cost of your payback overall less over time. But you're not required to. As you know, you have in-school deferment, so that's not a requirement. But if you plan on, or if you are pretty sure that your path is going to be working at a nonprofit hospital, or the VA, or something that's very clearly going to get you to forgiveness, or your balance is just a very large amount compared to your income, then we shouldn't be paying a penny more than we need to. So we'd only want to pay when we're required to. We'd only want to pay the required monthly payment. So that's quick tip number 1. Now, number 2 is pursue your life goals and dreams. And I'm so serious about this. I know I talked a lot about PSLF. That might not be the route some of you want to take, and that's okay. There are trade-offs to going public service or taking one job over another. Your loans should not stop you. We want to design the loan repayment plan around you and your life choices, not the other way around. We don't want your loans to dictate your future life choices. So that's something I think you should keep in mind too. And number 3, from a financial planning perspective, we just got to shout out, limit spending on very expensive things. So it'll be tempting to, once you start having a regular income coming in, to want to buy things that you've wanted for a really long time. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. You just want to make sure that you stay within really healthy spending parameters, because your savings rate and putting money down or putting money towards your future is really important. And the earlier you can start that, the better. The sooner you might be able to retire, which might sound so far out for some folks today, but limiting your spending and limiting how much you commit your dollars to per month in the form of mortgages or car payments, that can help make savings easier. And it won't be so much of a lifestyle shock 5 years from now when you're realizing, oh, I don't have anything going towards savings. I'm going to have to change this. It's much easier to kind of rip the Band-Aid off from the beginning, have healthy savings habits, have healthy spending parameters. That way there's no big lifestyle changes you have to make later if we're not on the right track. And 4, avoid the wrong repayment plans. An efficient repayment plan is very important. It helps us do other things with our money and helps us feel confident about the plan. And then number 5 is just pay as much as possible on the loans or as little as possible on the loans, which I know is 2 polar opposites, but there is a very clear path. No matter who you are, no matter what direction you're taking with your career, it's going to be one or the other route. It's just a matter of what's going to be best for you. So there's a plan for that. And then, just think it's a good time to think about your plan. And this hopefully is maybe a little stress relieving in a way, to know that it's not such a mystery about what this might look like in the future. So I think, educate yourself now on your options so it's not so much of a surprise post-graduation. And then if you need help, you can reach out to us. This is what we do every day. We put together student loan repayment plans. So we'd be happy to help and put together your custom plan if it was something you needed some assistance with. Or our blog or podcast are really helpful for learning anything student loan related. Studentaid.gov is a really important resource as well. That's the federal hub for all things federal student loans. But so I'm going to pause there. I know we went through a lot of information, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I will step down for a second and see if there's anything that anybody has they are curious about.
Hi, Megan. So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know if I took a shower. So if I missed the ground rules, I'm going to raise my hand for questions. But I was wondering if you could talk about emotions, right? When it comes to money, a huge part of money is emotions. So I'm going to throw out a hypothetical scenario, which is I'm a nursing student at Yale. Let's say I have $120,000 of debt from going to Yale. I went to George Washington for undergrad. So let's say I have $80,000 of student loan debt from my undergrad. So I have $200,000. Now let's say I marry a doctor at Yale because, you know, we both go to the hospital and he has $300,000 of student loan debt. So before I even start working, my family is $500,000 in student loan debt and we haven't even started. What do you tell the people here who are feeling hopeless about their student loan situation, who haven't even started and, you know, they are in the multiple six figures and they just don't even know what to do? Is there anyone where you're just like, I can't handle this situation? And then for those people who are like $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 in student loan debt, what do you tell them to keep them from giving up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And money is very much emotional. It ties into a lot of areas. It definitely can influence decisions that you make in the future, life decisions, money decisions. So, you know, my first thought is there's always going to be a plan that works for somebody. And this might be a good time to maybe show our little calculator. This could be a good way to show the math behind why it can be okay. And, you know, I think it's intimidating knowing that, my goodness, you know, I have 6 figures of student loan debt, maybe multiple 6 figures of student loan debt, and I'm marrying someone who has 6 figures of student loan debt too. I would encourage you to not think about the balance so much and more so think about, one, the repayment strategy, because that's really going to dictate how we're going to tackle it, and then also what we're going to be able to do with our money. And so let me maybe take that example. I'll treat it maybe as single for now. So I'm going to put, you know, 200,000 in for our own student loan debt balance from undergrad and from grad school. And let's say that we do work at maybe a nonprofit hospital and we plan on staying there, or we at least think we might go to another public service entity afterwards if we did move employers. Let's say we're single for now. We'll look at maybe a married example here in a second. And I plugged in an average that I got for income to see, you know, what would this type of balance look like with this type of income coming in on the repayment options that you could have available with these loans. So let's take a look at our calculations tab. And actually, let me show you maybe an example. So the year before you graduate, you probably haven't made much income. Usually that's not the case. Usually that is the case, where but the year before graduating, we probably didn't make much income at all. But when it comes to when you apply for an income-driven plan post-graduation, it's always going to link back to your most recently filed tax return. So even if you made like $10,000 that year, for example, your first payment is going to be based off of this first tax return. And that was technically last year, let's say. So the payment's always going to be about a year behind on when it actually reflects your current income. And let's say you make about $98,000 a year, but you started that partially through the year because you graduated in May. So for that, this full year, for example, maybe we only make about half that because we started in June or July. And let's say our full year of income kicks in 2022. So maybe about 98,000, and that grows slightly over time. So we have some pay bumps over time with our income. Now, when we apply for a repayment plan, remember, if we're pursuing public service loan forgiveness, we want to be on an income-driven option. And so here's the different income-driven plans we had talked about. The 2 lowest income-driven options are based on 10% of your discretionary income. So that first year, it's going to be based off of a lower income year and actually generates a $0 payment, which keeps the loans in good standing, and that $0 payment qualifies for public service loan forgiveness if that's the route we're going. It also qualifies for the longer term income-driven repayment forgiveness. So again, the rule of thumb is, if we're not pursuing PSLF, you know, where's our balance? Is our balance greater than our income? In this case, yes, it is. And so we should probably consider this longer term route towards forgiveness as well, if PSLF is not going to be the option. But as time goes on, you see, a partial year of income, payment being about $243. So remember, the payments on an income-driven plan are totally proportionate to your income. So it won't be such a shock, I would say, because it's proportionate. And then once your $98,000 of income kicks in, that payment's about $650, let's say. And you only see it slightly increase over time, so I'm assuming your income increases over time. And as you remember, pay as you earn has a 20-year time frame to forgiveness if we were going to go that longer term route. Repay has a 25-year, so pay to me looks pretty nice. And if we're going towards PSLF, we'll be done in about 10 years. So let's see this how it's stretched out over time in comparison. So to someone who's really nervous about their big balance and what that's going to look like, and starting off their career or their marriage with a lot of debt, again, I would encourage you to think about it maybe more like a tax, in the sense that if we're going towards PSLF, for example, you're going to pay 120 payments or 10 years worth of payments. On that $200,000, you're going to pay about $71,000 on the loans themselves in the form of your payments between, let's say, now and 2031, 10 years. You're going to get about $248 forgiven, and that's going to be tax-free, so we don't have to pay taxes on it. So our $200,000 student loan balance really only cost us about $71,000, and from that perspective, since we're treating it like a debt, we have a lot more cash flow back in our pocket to start building our net worth, because we're not focusing on putting our dollars towards this balance. And so we can start focusing on putting our dollars towards the things that will move the needle on your net worth, which is going to be your savings and your retirement. So this makes it seem a little more doable, a lot more doable, I think. And so even if we were to look at maybe a longer term income-driven example, so let's say we're not going to do public service loan forgiveness. It's not the route our career took us. We could still go the longer term route towards forgiveness, which is where on pay as you earn, we pay for 20 years. Whatever balance is left over is then forgiven. So between now and the next 20 years, we pay about $184, less than what we initially borrowed. We have about $255 forgiven, which is a lot. So our balance actually grows. It doesn't really move anywhere fast, and it grows in those earlier years, but that's okay if we're treating it like a tax. And again, mentally, we need to treat it that way if we're going this longer term route. Now, the difference between the longer term forgiveness and PSLF is there might be a tax implication for this forgiven balance. So that sounds a little scary, but a couple optimistic thoughts here. They're talking about, Biden and Congress have been talking about eliminating this tax implication. So this might not actually exist by the time you were getting to that longer term forgiveness timeline. And if that's the case, then you walk away only paying $184 on a debt that you had started with about $200. So we've robbed the student loan bank in that sense. If it is still around, then I want to look at, how does this look like in regards to the total cost compared to other options? Well, 286 includes the payments we've made plus the taxes we've paid here and the total cost here. So the 286, so that gets us our total cost. Compared to Repay, we pay a lot less because we pay for 5 years less. So that makes sense to me. Repay, that's why Repay isn't as great if we have access to Pay, because it's shorter. The standard 10-year plan, it's pretty interesting. It's only about a $20,000 difference in the total cost, but I think it comes at a separate cost in this case. If we're wanting to pay these off very aggressively, pay it off within 10 years, let's say, we'd have to pay about $2,200 a month. It's a little cheaper than this pay as you earn route if the tax implication is still around, but if it's not, we would have paid less going this longer term route. And so I think that's what starts to make me think that, the very aggressive route to paying off loans, it really only needs to be considered if your balance is lower than your income, because mathematically it starts to make less and less sense, especially if we don't have a lot of cash flow to put towards anything else per month. Because, and what I mean by, I think this comes at a separate cost, is $2,200 going out the door compared to, maybe an average of $650. That's a big difference. And that's a lot of money that we could be saving, or we could be putting towards other life things that we wouldn't have if we went this really aggressive route. So we're not able to build our wealth sooner, which I think is always key. If we're able to start saving sooner, that's going to be really great for our future self. And taking an aggressive approach with these numbers doesn't really make sense from that perspective. But I hope I'm not rambling. Is this starting to maybe bring some thoughts or some concepts to full circle on why I think maybe thinking about your loans more so like a tax in certain circumstances could be behaviorally better from a money perspective, and emotionally it could maybe lift some stress off your shoulders on starting off with that much debt? Is that helpful so far, or not quite?
So I just want to make sure I understand. It sounds like for most of us, like, hey, if you don't get a scholarship, PSLF might be the best route for us to start thinking about repayment. Is that?
It could be, but I wouldn't force PSLF. If there's not a career opportunity that you're interested in that PSLF fits well with, and I think the longer term forgiveness could be a good option to consider too. I don't think that's something to discount. It is a little bit longer, but there's trade-offs. If you go in the public service route, maybe we're not paid as much. Maybe the hours or the work itself isn't what we enjoy. So I think we can make either work. I think maybe the moral of the story here is more so, let's make the loans work for you, your plan on your life, versus let's not let the loans dictate what you're doing and what job you should be doing.
Thank you.
I have a connecting question. So if, let's say I started on the PSLF and was using that as my plan, and then maybe 5 years down the line, I start working in the private sector. Do the payments that went into PSLF, do those qualify for, are those the same kind of payments that would go under Repay or Pay, or are those completely separate kinds of payments?
They do. So you're essentially going towards both forgiveness times at the same time if you're working in public service, because you have to be on one of these income-driven plans to be pursuing PSLF. And so if you forgo PSLF, you're still 5 years into the longer term.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of the 30 hours, let's say someone is working numerous different jobs within qualifying facilities. In that case, does it have, if it's per diem, for example, does that qualify if it equals 30 hours, or does it have to be a standard salary job for the 30 hours?
No, as long as you're working directly for that public service or qualifying entity, you'd have to do separate employment certification forms, but as long as those hours per week averaged out over 30, then that does qualify. And
sorry, last question. So for the employment certification forms, we're supposed to be filling those out annually as we're doing this plan? Or if, let's say I feel like I've been doing public service I thought I was when I was working as an RN, but I never got a form filled out, but I know my facility qualifies. Should I have filled out a form back then? Are those null and void?
No, so the form is retroactive. It's always going to be retroactive because they don't know if you're going to work full-time in public service tomorrow. So if you turned one in for that employer for that specific time frame, you can collect all of those payments for that time.
Okay.
We recommend submitting it once a year just to keep a pulse on the payment counts, to make sure that they're counting the same amount of payments that you are, but it's not required. You'll never lose them. You just want to make sure you stay on top of getting the form submitted. We recommend at least annually.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Caitlin?
Great, thank you. What if you have a mix of federal and private? Like, what if you, like, 80% was federal and that was about the equivalence of your income? And then you had, you know, I don't know, 30 to 40, about 40 to 50K in private loans. Would it still be beneficial to do the loan forgiveness route in that regard, but aggressively pay off the private loans? Or how does having a small amount of private loans change things if it does?
Yeah, it could definitely still make sense to potentially pursue forgiveness with the federal side. You just want to do the math with what your income is and what the balance is. Like, do we get there, or should we maybe treat them all more aggressively? But generally, you could have a split approach where the federal, we have a very passive strategy, but the private, we're tackling more aggressively. And another benefit to that too is, you know, using the flexibility of the Fed system could help you better or more optimally tackle the private loans more aggressively, because you won't have two huge payments, you know, for both, or potentially you won't, based on the options you'll have on the federal side. So it gives you a little more cash flow to be able to throw to the private loans, and refinancing those private loans could be a good option to knock down that interest rate to help you save more as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Allie, did you have a question?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was wondering if the 10 years for the PSLF is the minimum, or if you made the 120 payments faster, could you get it faster?
It's the minimum. So you can have public service loan forgiveness in a minimum of 10 years. I wish you can get that sped up. Some interesting things though, I do think PSLF might see some improvements here over the next couple of years. So these are, as I know, PSLF to be true today. You know, in the next couple of years, there could be some other opportunities available. Just depends on what Congress does here over the next few years, I think. But as we know, right now, you have to make monthly payments for a total of about 10 years. And that's the earliest you can get the forgiveness.
Once you're in, like once you fill out the forms and you have like qualifying payments towards that 120, does it show up somewhere on your like federal student aid site? Is there somewhere you could see like how many payments you have towards it? Because I think part of like that negative press you're saying, I feel like I've read things about people get to the 10 years, they thought they were doing the right thing, and then they actually didn't do the right thing.
Yeah, there is now there is a public service loan forgiveness tracker within FedLoan servicing. So let me see, I could probably actually pull that up real quick. But it's pretty cool. It does track your payments real time now. And why I said FedLoan, so FedLoan servicing is one of the student loan servicers. They are who's deemed responsible for the program, public service loan forgiveness now. So if your servicer is somebody different, but you do end up pursuing PSLF, your loans will move over to FedLoan once you submit that employment certification form for the first time. So if you're not there, don't worry, they'll move your loans over there. But once you are there, you'll see in your little dashboard underneath billing or payments and billing, you'll have this little PSLF payment tracking system. And it shows you how many qualifying payments you have towards the 120. And it'll fill up the need employment certification bucket with payments that you've made but have not gotten an employment certification form submitted for yet. But as soon as that form is submitted, they'll flip over into this qualifying bucket. So you can always keep a pulse on which payments have counted, you know, and also track which ones are qualifying. And this is what that employment certification form looks like. So let me maybe zoom it in a little bit. It public service loan forgiveness, certification and application. So you'd fill out your basic information, I'll kind of scroll down to the employer. You'd fill out your employer information, and somebody at the employer signs off on this to confirm that, yep, you do work here, this was your start date, that all the employer information is correct. And then you either mail it or fax it to FedLoan if you don't have them yet as a servicer, or you can upload it into your portal with FedLoan, which there's this little file upload button that you can use, which is easier than mailing it once you're already at FedLoan.
So I just want to plug everyone, definitely don't be nervous. You know, if you're thinking of a question, someone else is probably thinking about it. So I've met with many of you all, so if you have any questions, any thoughts, please be sure to plug it out loud before we run out of time today.
Yeah, and student loans are complicated. You know, don't feel like this is stuff you should have known. Our federal loan system is very complex. So don't feel ashamed or don't feel bad about not knowing these things. I literally had to have a financial board certification to learn all this information. So it's a lot, and it's not impossible to navigate, but asking the right questions and having the right help or the right repayment plan is very pivotal in your success here. Yeah, I think I see a hand for Lindy.
Yeah, hi, my name's Linda. I was wondering, is there a penalty generally with these programs if you pay it back sooner, if you inherit some money from your grandparents or something and want to get rid of your loans? Is that a bad idea? Is that penalized from these programs?
Nope, no penalization. There's no fee to accelerate or pay the loans off faster. You just want to make sure that mathematically it made sense to do that. But if it did, then there's no penalty, no downside to doing it in my mind.
Okay. One other question. Are you aware of a lot of the federally qualified health centers provide student loan forgiveness? It's usually done on, like, they will, pay back X amount every year if you commit for 3 years to working for them. Are you familiar with this loan forgiveness situation?
Yeah, there's a couple. There's like NRSA. There's a few specifically to nursing and to the medical profession. It depends on what program it is, but it's generally a grant that they give you up to a certain amount. And it's for a commitment of either working at a specific facility or working in a specific area or high need area for a specific period of time. So some programs will front that grant, meaning they give that money to you immediately, and it is supposed to be going towards your loans. But if you forfeit that agreement, if you don't uphold your end of that deal, you do have to pay it back. So that's something you want to keep in mind. You want to commit to it if you are very sure that you can commit to it. But if you are, it is a great option because you can either, and again, depending on the program, you can either drop that grant on the balance as a lump sum, or you can use that, put that in savings, use that money for your monthly payments to be drafted from if you're pursuing PSLF. And that would make sense to do if that grant money would not pay off your balance. And we might still need to go towards PSLF, or that's still an option. So there is a way to use both in your favor. And I think if the grant is not going to pay off the balance, I would put that in savings, have the payments draft from that. That way you're not coming out of pocket for your monthly payments. And that way you're also pursuing PSLF at the same time. But the lump sum could be beneficial if it could knock out your balance in a couple of years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maxwell?
Hi. Yeah. I think this is pretty simple, but I've just been wondering because I haven't heard it said. If I pursue the public service loan forgiveness plan, would that forgiveness include my loans for my undergraduate studies as long as they are federal?
Yes, as long as they're federal, and federal direct loans is what you want. The ones that don't qualify that could be federal are what's called FFEL loans, which again, you shouldn't have if you did not borrow before 2010, but undergrad does qualify.
And Megan, there's just a question here in the chat I would like to plug. It says, can you address the simultaneous Nurse Corps or National Health Service Corps repayment, Nurse Corps or National Health Service Corps, as well as public service loan forgiveness plans?
Yeah. And I'm guessing, or I'm thinking that that's a little bit of what I covered a moment ago, but are they talking in regards to like two different grant programs together?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's two questions here. The first question being, if I'm doing a HRSA related loan repayment program, can I do public service loan forgiveness at the same time? And then the second question being, if I received a full ride through a HRSA program and I'm now doing my service commitment, can my payments during that time period apply to my public service loan forgiveness plan?
Oh, perfect. Yes to both. They can qualify in both of those instances.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think nurses have really unique opportunities for these grant programs. It's y'all's profession is one of the only that have so many opportunities, I think, compared to others. So I think that's really awesome.
Question from Maya.
Just if folks are doing residencies, can you count that first year if it's within like a federally qualified health center towards PSLF?
Yes, that's a great question. And you absolutely should take advantage of those residency periods or fellowship periods, because that's when you're paid the least, if anything. And so if you could start getting qualifying payments, right after graduation, when your income is the lowest, your payments are going to be really low. And then you bank all of that time towards forgiveness for those years. So I'd absolutely recommend, if you're going towards any forgiveness in some way, you want to make sure you can start payments as soon as possible. And since the income-driven options are proportionate to your income, you can usually, I haven't seen a case where it was impossible for someone to add in a small payment, because the payment can be as low as $0 as well, based on the last tax return. So definitely a good idea to get that clock started as soon as you can. That way you don't have to pay more later.
Yeah, and I would just plug to Megan's point. I'm using public service loan forgiveness now, and since as a result of the CARES Act, my $0 a month payments have been applying towards my my public service loan forgiveness account, right? So I'm a student as well, as some of you know. So I'm not actively repaying my loans, but it's good to know that if I go to HR and I submit my paperwork, this past couple months have counted. It's really helped offset some of my 120 payments. So definitely worth exploring.
Yep.
So it looks like the questions have dried up. So I think, Megan, if you want to but if you want to provide information of the link for your student loan planner and the website and scheduling an appointment and some time, then I think that'll be great. And then if, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that'll be great.
Sure. Yeah, y'all can find us. Yeah, let me share my screen again. Just at studentloanplanner.com. We have lots of free content on our website. If you had questions about literally anything student loan related, we have a blog, we have a podcast. You can search topics specifically, income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness. And then if you feel like you'd like a customized plan for your repayment course of action, especially if you feel like you might have a complicated situation, like maybe a spouse has student loans as well, or maybe they don't, and you don't want your spouse's income factored into your plan, then you can schedule a custom plan with us. And then you can email us too if you have maybe one-off questions. But Yeah, that's where you can find us, just studentloanplanner.com. And I consult on Mondays and Wednesdays if you'd like to be on my calendar specifically. But yeah, I'll put that maybe in the chat right now too.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if one of the co-hosts want to say anything before we close up for the day. For one of the planners, I should say.
Nope, we usually just kind of wrap up from here. This is our very last Black History Month event for 2021. So I want to thank Megan for coming out and educating us on student loans. I will talk to, I know a lot of people have been asking for recordings. I'm going to talk to Mary Kate, and then we'll send out an email about where all of the events can be rewatched. And I think that is it. Thanks everybody for coming out and supporting.